and then I'll record as well.
Okay, well, I'll start admitting everybody. Are you ready to run with your PowerPoint?
You bet.
Okay, all righty. One more thing I got to do. Okay, I'm going to admit folks. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Stefan Sommer. I am with the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, and you have joined the Climate Talks for Everyone, which is a speaker series that is hosted by NASCA, the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, Fridays for Future US and Fridays for Future International, and Prescott College. So we're glad that you could join us. And we're very happy today to be hosting Dr. Rod Parnell, who is a longtime NAU faculty member, Northern Arizona University faculty member. He's been here at NAU since 1984. And let me just introduce him a little bit, give you some of his background, and then we'll let him run with the program. So that you all know, Dr. Rod Parnell is Professor Emeritus of Earth and Sustainability at Northern Arizona University. He's a Senior Fellow of the Global Council for Science and the Environment and past President of the Council of Environmental Deans and Directors. He served on the boards of directors of the National Council for Science and the Environment, Arizona Forward, and the Colorado Plateau Forum. His research focuses on the application of biogeochemistry and geomorphology to sustainable river management in the Western United States and on the transformation of environmental curricula to improve sustainability education. He has worked on the effects of acid rain, volcanic emissions, and sulfide mineral deposits on terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And I happen to know that he's also a movie star because he starred in a film I produced about the restoration of Fossil Creek. So Rod brings many, many talents and a depth of knowledge to the topic of how to reach the unconvinced. So Dr. Parnell, with that, I'll let you take it away. And if I said any of the introduction wrong, please fill in for me.
Well, thank you, Stefan. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate it. And I will never forget my days as a movie star under your august direction. So thank you. I am going to go ahead and share my screen at this point and move to a PowerPoint presentation. And we can go through that hopefully pretty quickly and start a discussion as soon as possible. So I want to thank you all for the invitation to talk with you today and to share some of my frustrations, observations, and ideas about how we can work to move forward together in terms of convincing the unconvinced about the real hazards and reality of climate change and the need for adaptation and mitigation. Sorry, let's try again. So when we're talking about convincing someone, we're talking about having them trust what we're saying and having a willingness to be able to believe what it is that we're trying to convince them of. Traditionally, trust levels have been high in so-called specialized areas of medicine or engineering or auto mechanics, things that tend to have more of a technical bent. And trust tends to be much lower in complex or evolving fields that tackle new challenges and come at things from new directions. And one example of this is in environmental sciences and management, where combining many disciplines in both interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary ways to try and tackle questions that need to be addressed through changing human and societal behavior. Uh, so when we talk about these complex interdisciplinary areas and we start adding in the need to think about policy formulation and implementation, things get really messy with respect to our ability to um, convince people. Uh, but the bottom line is that trust can always increase through the building of personal interactions and relationships. So I think that's the most critical point to get out of our conversation today is building trust can happen, but it tends to happen in a personal way. So when we're talking about your criteria for what makes a scientific expert, there are traditional things that you think about in terms of advanced education in the field, experience practicing the discipline once you're done with your formal academic training, um, having a peer review process assess your work in publications and grants, and also recognition by your peers, by other professionals in your field through things like awards or elective offices. So these tend to be the kinds of things that people put out there, like Stefan just did a few minutes ago when trying to establish a scientist's expertise. Same thing with respect to literature, is that there are criteria that have been established through the centuries with respect to what is a solid and reliable basis for decision making or belief based upon the reliability of that data source. So you can Google it, or you can go to the library, in this case, our Klein Library on the NAU campus, and you're going to have a much different range of options when it comes to the material that you're going to be able to peruse. Another thing about experts is that they can be easily and widely belittled by people who don't want to hear what those experts say. So what we will see over the course of the rest of this conversation is that there have been attempts to bully experts into backing off, or at least not pushing their own expertise. And this, unsurprisingly, includes people in the political sphere, like Donald Trump. And this quote comes from the New York Times in 2017. As he talks about denigrating expertise and the elite, we should remember that he is a New York City billionaire with an Ivy League degree, and somehow that doesn't make him an elite, meaning that elites tend to be in the eye of the beholder. And the term elite has become one of disparagement these days rather than of admiration. So that leads to the question, why? Why attack expertise? And I think Carl Sandburg sums it up the best. What we find is that people who disagree with the facts that have been presented attack the person rather than the science. And one of the best examples of this kind of ongoing attack that has been occurring basically over the past 50 years has been in the convergence of the tobacco, chemical, and fossil fuels industries as expert scientific research confirmed fundamental and negative impacts of their products. So, two of the more recent books focusing on um, this effort on the part of these corporations uh, is Doubt is Their Product by David Michaels and The Parrot and the Igloo by David Lipsky. And I highly recommend these deep dives into the um, culture of doubt production. Needless to say, this attack on expertise and on science itself accelerating through the past 20 or 30 years as we see more and more of it. And it becomes more of a personal attack, rather than just an attack on the quality of the science. Turns out that we are America's greatest domestic threats. So beware. Why go through this process? Well, one of the reasons is that increasing doubt can help generate uncertainty in facts that had been well established. It can create uncertainty in identifying what expertise is, even though we've had a good idea as to what might constitute expertise for hundreds of years. And uncertainty is also involved in the inability to differentiate rigorous science from so-called junk science, which has not met the standards of the scientific community, particularly with respect to peer review and with respect to the utilization of standard scientific methods. So then you wind up with these logical fallacies, such as the fact that, well, cigarettes can't cause cancer because cancer existed before there were cigarettes. Two other well-known authors that have dived into this um, doubt industry point out that large corporations, whether it's in tobacco or in fossil fuels, have been misleading the public about climate change, even though they're well aware behind closed doors of the truthfulness of that research and those projections. Well, why create this uncertainty? One of the reasons for that is that it can help maintain the status quo by having an inability to move forward with making decisions. The status quo continues. And if you deprive people of the ability to make decisions, then they are also deprived of their capacity to think and to judge. And as Hannah Arendt said back in the 70s, with such people, you can then do what you please. So there are many ways to help establish doubt and to help deny the reality of the overwhelming consensus of science and technical experts by going outside of the bounds of scientific rigor. And so we'll look very briefly at a couple of these um, techniques. Fake experts, you're probably aware of. Impossible expectations, which include things, as we'll talk about, like certainty. We need to be certain before we could move forward. Well, what do you mean by certain? Cherry picking is another example where people deliberately or just sloppily misconstrue uh, data in the literature or statements in the literature for their own purposes rather than making a good faith effort to understand what's being said. And then conspiracy theories are growing like crazy with respect to um, how and why all these nasty scientists are doing these terrible things. So, one example of both cherry picking and anecdotal reasoning rather than using a scientific database was best established in 2015 when a senator from Oklahoma made a snowball outside in January, by the way, um, made a snowball outside and brought it into the Senate chambers. Snowball exists, global warming cannot exist. And it's not just a one off thing. We've seen this over and over again with respect to this doubt industry that consists of fossil fuels funded think tanks and research institutes that go counter to the vast consensus of the scientific community, whether it's tobacco smoke, acid rain, ozone in the atmospheres and CFCs. Uh, the playbook has been well established and has been running for a long time. So, one way to help establish doubt and uncertainty is to push the idea that global warming, global climate change, is a theory and not a fact. And so the Information Council for the Environment, funded by ExxonMobil, had established a variety of different multimedia approaches to this concept, um, starting in the late 80s and going through the 1990s. So we have these fake experts cherry picking of data to try and convince you that the question of global climate change is still very much a question. Well, is it a question? When you actually bother to look at the databases, for example, these four databases from NASA, NOAA, Great Britain, and Japan, it seems like there's pretty good consensus on whether or not climate change has been occurring. Fake experts have made a cottage industry, not so cottage actually, pretty big cottage, hundreds of millions of dollars at this point, of questioning scientific consensus. So in 2014, the International Panel on Climate Change, I'm sorry, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published one of their 5-year summary reports on the state of the climate in 2014. This was sponsored by the United Nations and was a product of over 13,000 climate scientists from around the world working together in work groups to be able to come out with these observations and recommendations. They cited more than 1,000 peer-reviewed references in this synthesis report and have since updated it several times since the 2014 release. At about the same time, interestingly enough, about a year later, a group called the Heartland Institute published its own report by the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. The the NIPCC, not the IPCC, But there was no attempt to try and be at least disingenuous with respect to the similarity of the names. The authors were a little bit different in terms of size and expertise. There were no climate scientists or researchers that worked on this report. It referred to zero public peer-reviewed publications and only one um, effort to make this report. It was a one-off in 2015, but was distributed widely. In fact, as an environmental science professor, I got a free copy of this in the mail, unsolicited. And it's my understanding that hundreds of thousands of copies of these documents went out to secondary and university instructors. Let's look at a couple of the ways that the Heartland Institute's report really epitomizes what we can call junk science. Um, First of all, it gets the facts wrong. Even of the scientific literature and the scientists who produced it support the claim of, not the claim, the fact of global climate change. They claim that was not true. It also slandered the gold standard for climate science research, which is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and said that governments should not be relying on the IPCC for scientific advice. No reason was given, but clearly they're experts and elites, so their advice should be taken with a grain of salt. The Heartland Institute's conclusions also contradicted our own United States state science standards for primary and secondary schools in textbook books and curricula, except the recently changed curricula in the state of Florida. It also goes out of its way to avoid peer review literature. When it does cite real papers in scientific journals like Nature and Science, the citations are taken out of context and misconstrued, or they're cited, but then we are told that they're incorrect. Most of the citations within the document refer to Heartland's own publications, and so we basically have this circular loop of one publication reinforcing and citing another related one. Well, another aspect of creating doubt is to develop impossible expectations. So what we need to do before we can decide anything is to eliminate uncertainty. Well, on the face of that, that might sound interestingly viable. Well, we shouldn't have uncertainty. The problem is that uncertainty is always going to extend to any decisions that we make. And uncertainty even occurs in statistics where at least it is constrained in a quantitative way. One of the problems that we have is the nature of the societal problems and environmental problems that we're dealing with are so complex and require perspectives from so many different fields that it's incredibly hard to come up with high levels of certainty across all of those fields that are being drawn upon to make climate science happen. Well, we all know scientists, I'm sure, and we know that every scientist who you ever met will tell you that whatever they're studying there's going to be a need for further study. Well, yeah, that's kind of what science is about, right? Science is about refinement, not absolutism. And we will continue to refine our perspectives on social and natural sciences through a progressive approach of getting closer and closer to limiting uncertainty, but never eliminating it. One of the things that the tobacco, air pollution, and fossil fuels industries have done is to use the concept of need for further study to help delay any kind of regulation for any of these problematic products that these industries make. Another place of uncertainty is models. And models are widely disparaged in the climate doubt industry because they're not based solely on facts. They are based upon mathematical algorithms that large databases, but they are models. They're not absolute truth. The problem that we have as scientists who want to try and think about what might happen in the future is that models are the only way to be able to predict future events other than magic 8 balls and Ouija boards. The problem is that because they tend to be highly mathematical and depend upon past and current data, they have to make assumptions about future conditions as these models are run. So, what do we do about uncertainty? Well, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, basically the people who tell us what certainty is with respect to measurements, with respect to industrial standards and so forth, have rejected the idea that we should be requiring reasonable scientific certainty. That is, reasonable scientific certainty, a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, or any such term, do not recognize the reality of medicine and science. And such terms, first of all, have no scientific meaning because those aren't the terms that we use, and will certainly mislead decision makers in terms of trying to find that elusive, reasonable scientific certainty. So what NIST had recommended, rather than using that term, is that experts make a statement about the study that they made and an expression of the uncertainty in the data and in the methods. And the experts should also state the bases for those levels of uncertainty. Of course, nobody wants to hear that. They want to hear if it's 95% certain or 99.9% certain, and that's a number we can very seldom produce. So then the question becomes, well, if we don't have absolute certainty, what should we do? And in Europe, and in fact, across much of the globe except the United States, there's a process called the precautionary principle that is used and widely applied in decision making with respect to health and the environment. And that is where there are serious threats of irreversible damage, a lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for delay. This was part of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development in 1992 and has been used widely in multinational and regional agreements, and also routinely by the European Union as defined in the Maastricht Treaty that talks about criteria for these agreements. So there is a way out there that has been used when we don't have full scientific certainty established beyond anyone's ability to doubt it. On top of that, though, you can have complete certainty. You can be completely convinced of the facts that you have and still be totally wrong. And this is something that drove Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan nuts, to the point where he issued his famous quote about not being entitled to your own facts. It goes back a long time, even before Moynihan's term in the Senate. In 1961, with the increase in multimedia, television, newspapers, radio, we began to see a divergence of people's interests and focus in terms of what they want to do and who they want to read and who they want to believe, so that we can find our own reality and live in them based upon where we choose to go.
Dr. Parnell?
Yeah,
There is a question in the chat from Camilla in Sweden,
sure.
and you might be getting to this already, I'm not sure, but she's asking what the data are on the how widespread climate skepticism is among the publics in the United States or the world.
Okay, I will put up some numbers. The most recent Pew surveys from a week ago in a few minutes.
Wonderful, thank you.
And the way that people get to those decisions is through the information that they acquire. And what we've seen with respect to some of the largest social media platforms is a real range in terms of the degree to which these platforms are willing to combat misinformation and disinformation with, unsurprisingly, Twitter or X being at the bottom of the scale in terms of a lack of effective policy enforcement on climate misinformation. So this was a ranking done by the Climate Action Against Disinformation group, which also includes Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace. The problem that we have is that climate change is the worst kind of problem for people to deal with. We have some cognitive distortions that have been wired in over tens of thousands of years through our evolution. And one of these distortions is something called availability bias. And that is the fact that we tend to overestimate the likelihood of rare events like major earthquakes in California, and then as a result, place too little weight on chronic problems like air pollution or climate change. So the availability bias weighs against our consideration of chronic problems. We also tend to pursue motivated reasoning, that is, trying to find evidence to rationalize our pre-existing beliefs. So that means that we tend to be slow to change. We're always looking for more information, hopefully to reinforce what we're already thinking, but also to delay our willingness to change our opinion. And then we're also very good at confirmation bias, the ability to selectively seek out information that affirms what we already believe. These things really slant our ability as humans, not as Democrats or Republicans or Green Party or anything else. These are human traits that transcend uh, particular political perspectives. However, on top of that, we also are um, social animals, and we tend to affiliate with parties or tribes, and having those ties to a particular tribe or group of individuals is important to us, and we're more likely to move in the direction of a tribal consensus than to individually move in a separate direction based upon what we've learned from policy briefs or fact checkers. Confirmation bias, of course, is very easy to um, achieve these days with basically 2 billion websites, active websites out there. We can have the ability to focus pretty much wherever we want, whenever we want. So we tend to surf for information or go back to sites, social media where we are most comfortable. So we see a superficial sampling of information and cherry picking of the data. Also, where we go for our news is greatly influenced by our social ties or tribal membership. And tribalism requires some tests, right? Not everybody can be a member of the tribe. You need to prove your um, cred as a real Republican, for example, and not a Republican in name only. And as we've seen over the past 20 years, we've moved from climate change being a nonpartisan, widespread concern across the political spectrum to one that is completely polarized within the American political community. It's part of the litmus test issues that determine whether or not you're a good Republican, or for that matter, a good Democrat. So, what do we see as a result of that? Here's last week's um, Pew survey of Americans who and what they think about climate scientists. So, when we ask Americans what climate scientists understand about climate change, is climate change occurring? Well, more than half of Democrats believe that there's a very good understanding by climate scientists, and another 35% believe that it's a fairly good understanding of climate change. Republicans, on the other hand, only 11% feel that climate scientists have a very good idea as to what's happening with the existence of climate change. If climate scientists can predict how climate change will impact extreme weather events, once again, Democrats, almost half, believe that climate scientists have a very good understanding of the influence of climate change on extreme weather events, whereas only 10% of Republicans feel that way. And then in terms of causes of climate change, it's even more severe in terms of the difference. Democrats, almost half, are very are convinced that we have a very good handle on the causes of climate change, and almost all the rest believe we have a fairly good handle on what causes climate change. Only 7% of Republicans or those leaning Republicans understand the way in which climate scientists um, look at and study the causes of climate change. So that's one way to look at it, is from a purely political perspective, Republican versus Democrat. Another way to look at it is from a religious perspective. And if we look at different religions here in the United States, what we find is that the percentage of adults who say climate change is caused mostly by human activity, 3/4 of those unaffiliated, 70%, 3/4 of Hispanic Catholics, 70% of other non-Christian religions, um, excluding well, non-Christian religions, yeah, sorry. And that includes Jewish, um, the Jewish religions as about 2/3. And we can see it keeps going down as we move into Protestant, white Catholic, and um, uh, LDS. And then finally, only a third, less than a third, of white evangelical Protestant um, Americans um, recognize that climate change is caused mostly by human activity. So this is also taken this year, in this case, back in June. And this reflects, or in the voting habits and records of our Congress people and senators, where we see back when a Republican president, Richard Nixon, created the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Environmental Policy Act back here in 1970, there was very little difference between Democrats and Republicans in terms of their League of Conservation Voters score. That is, this is a score created each year by the League of Conservation Voters to determine the degree to which individual members of Congress vote to support activity that helps preserve and protect the environment. And we can see since that initial time, we've got an increasing separation of voting habits by our Congress people, and that just has continued to increase. So, what can we do about this? Well, one of the things that we can do is to start to address fake news, doubt, confirmation bias. First of all, by unpacking the issue. What do we need to do? We could just focus on the facts and try and separate out the more controversial policy decisions with respect to the relative importance of free market and non-regulatory based solutions versus regulatory and government mandated solution. That could be considered a related but separate conversation, where first we can focus on the scientific facts. Recognizing that accepting a scientific fact does not require a certain specific policy response or a particular tribal membership. Another thing to address that is to try and create more human connection, try and build that trust. Try and get across the fact that scientists are really humans. We're not a priori elitists, and we all have stories that we want to tell based upon our own experience. And then the third thing to do is to debunk the nonsense, to address straight on the false information, the alternative facts, as it were. There's a really nice paper report produced by John Cook and Stefan Lewandowski in Australia a few years back that looks at how you might go about doing this. What they focus on is the fact that it's not just what people think, we should also be thinking about how people think. And the best approach is to focus on convincing them of the facts that you want to communicate. And the best way to do that is to not overwhelm people with a bunch of facts, but instead focus on a few facts that can replace the misinformation or myth that exists in that person's thought process at the present time. In order to do that, you have to create a gap in that person's mind with respect to this information. And you must also fill that gap with new information to help that person come to an improved conclusion. Now, looks like there's a lot here, but it's really pretty simple when you break it down to this is one myth or one fact that needs to be debunked. Back in 2016, during the presidential election, a group, a very small group in Oregon, came out with a OISM, that's the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine petition project, where they claimed that 31,000 scientists disagree with the scientific consensus on global warming. Okay, well, the fact is that 31,000 scientists didn't disagree, and over 97% of climate experts agree that humans are causing global warming. So what we need to get out is this fact and get rid of this misinformation. And it turns out that it's really pretty easy to debunk that myth. And what they found by actually reviewing the names and signatures in that petition project were that 99.9% of the scientists listed were not climate scientists. In fact, many were not scientists at all. And in fact, signatories included Charles Darwin and Albert Einstein. So the reliability of this OISM project was easily reputed once people took the time to do it. But that means taking the time to debunk the myth and replace it with the truth of 97%. By the way, only about 92% of geoscientists in the world agree with the concept of plate tectonics and continental drift. So there's more consensus on climate change than there is on plate tectonics. So when we're providing new information or new facts, this can have some conflict with respect to not just the new facts that they have accepted, but also preconceptions and beliefs, things like free market capitalism, that might have a bit of a problem processing these new facts. And there are also values that people bring to any kind of decision-making process. So in order to use these new facts in a decision-making process, they have to be filtered through these preconceptions and these values. So how does that happen? Well, first of all, people are going to ask, well, who's providing these facts? What are the experts? Who are the experts? And then taking the time to actually process these facts through your beliefs and recognize what your beliefs are, and then look at your own values with respect to, okay, if I believe in equity and liberty, then how does that affect decisions with respect to, say, environmental racism. Okay, so that's one thing that we can do to help address the scientific misinformation that's out there. The problem is that that's not the only concern. We're butting up against not just misinformation, but also deeply held value judgments that might appear to be in conflict with scientific information. So in 2017, a Christian conservative was quoted as saying that Jesus doesn't want us to think about global warming. And this was his tweet. So you can be a good steward of the planet, but you just don't have to follow the facts.
Yes.
So how do you cope with this? How do you deal with a person who feels like their value system does not allow them to accept scientific fact? Well, one thing that we can try and do is to overcome these tribal boundaries by humanizing both ourselves and the opposition. That is, what do we have in common? What shared values do we have? And how can we sit down together and build common vocabularies and concepts that allow us to share those values, facts, and beliefs that we have to find some kind of common policy solutions? And does this sound impossible? Well, no, it's not. And in fact, I just pulled this off the Conservative Climate Caucus website that's run by Representative John Curtis of Utah. It consists of 81 Republicans as of last week that recognizes that the climate is changing. And climate change is real, and that the global industrialization that we've had has contributed to that change. But what do they want to do about it? Well, they have policy ideas that may or may not be particularly effective, but are consistent with their own values and beliefs and conservative Republican tribal membership. And those occur with answers developed in the private sector for developing private sector innovation, developing more and better resource and development, and by embracing the free market. Okay, well, there's some overlap here. There's not as much as you might like, but it seems like there's at least some place for conversation to begin. The American Conservation Coalition is another conservative approach. This is an NGO that works to try and find creative solutions primarily based upon capitalism in the private sector. And once we've begun that conversation, we can discover some shared values and come to some successful policy making that has occurred. And so one of these has been through Floridians for Solar Choice. It's been led for several years by Debbie Dooley, who is a big Trump supporter and one of the co-founders of the Tea Party. And the way that she got together with people across the political spectrum is by focusing on Florida Amendment 4 in 2018 that developed pro-solar policies that allowed for more energy independence and for more local control on energy development and the grid. So there was this overlap between a desire for increasing solar energy development and more independence on the part of individuals to be able to generate the electricity. Another way that we've gone about that is with the formation of the Green Tea Coalition. Again, Debbie Dooley founded this, but it has had several offshoots as a result of that, including people who don't live in retirement communities and don't live in Florida. So the Green Tea Party Radio podcast is occurring regularly, hosted by three young conservatives who believe that reducing climate change and protecting the environment is fundamentally consistent with conservative beliefs. Conservation hawks, hunters and fishers are have always been very interested in conservation and often preservation as well. Um, Although we saw how few white Protestant evangelicals bought into the reality of climate change, there are groups like the Young Evangelicals for Climate Action who are committed to those changes. Another thing that we can do is to try and institutionalize this interaction, this cooperative behavior, to try and get participation early on in any kind of decision-making process involving energy and the environment, to set some goals and objectives, and not just to reaffirm previous decisions that were made. And this includes the ability to effectively listen, to be able to listen, understand, and share concepts, to share vocabulary, to define vocabulary, and to work together to create qualitative models that can be discussed to be able to move goals and objectives forward. Once these ideas are established, consensus building can occur based upon agreed upon shared perspectives. Now we'll just add that. But another way to move forward is through the promotion of scientific expertise and the recognition of the value of scientific research. And the International Science and Engineering Fair is one of many great ways to try and build esteem and trust in scientific research again. Another way is to make everyone a scientist. Federal crowdsourcing and citizen science catalogs exist and provide hundreds of opportunities for students to, not students, for citizens to engage with scientists in many different scientific endeavors, some of which are shown here. So, when that all comes to fruition, what do we see? Well, we see wins in the courts where groups of high school students have moved the Montana District Court to conclude that climate as a part of the environmental life support system is guaranteed by the Montana Constitution. So Montana must consider impacts of state actions on the climate. So this came about just a couple months ago, and a new case is moving forward in Hawaii with 14 more plaintiffs, again, teenagers. So where does that get us? Well, hopefully we've seen that we need to act collaboratively to be able to move forward with in our understanding of climate systems and what we can do to adapt to them. So if we can at least understand, if not accept others' views, we can get into conversations which can again build trust. We can respect each other's values, if not agree with all of them, and again, discover what these shared values will be and act upon those shared values rather than focusing on the differences between us. And as a result of that, then hopefully we can agree upon certain facts that will support a variety of different policy actions and proposals in both the public and private sector, and we might just be a little better off. Well, that's what I had for the formal part of the presentation. And Stefan, I think we've got some time to have some conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation, Dr. Parnell.
You're welcome.
I hope everybody enjoyed that, and I hope that he has stimulated you to think about this. I know we are all in one form or another involved in climate education and climate activism and different aspects of helping people understand climate change. So please formulate your questions for Dr. Parnell. And I also put the link for the Climate Talks for Everyone series into the chat. All past presentations are recorded and available for viewing at that link, and registrations for all upcoming presentations are also available there. We hope that this series will go on in perpetuity, and we are scheduling talks about every 2 weeks. So thank you for joining for this one, and please formulate your questions for Dr. Parnell. Well, I guess if nobody has an immediate question, taking it back to what you said at the beginning about trust. Certainly being part of a community establishes a foundation for trust. But then, like you said, personal interaction. So spending time with folks can be really important. And how do you best do that if you're trying to reach a community of, say, like here in Flagstaff, 80,000+ folks? How do you go about beginning to establish that trust?
Well, I don't know what percentage of our participants are from Flagstaff, but one of the things that we've had real success on is a commitment to out of doors experiences and to sharing what we have as a community, whether it is the physical environment or the culture. And so the participation that we have in things like Friends of the Rio, which is a non-governmental group that acts to try and improve the quality of the Rio de Flag here in Flagstaff. We have a museum, like in Prescott, there's a great museum as well. But here, our Museum of Northern Arizona reaches out across the natural and social sciences and provides a learning opportunity for people basically to experience all of the cultures and systems of the Colorado Plateau. So I think finding that willingness of people to work on a better understanding of their sense of place, their place in the community, in the region, how they relate to the peoples of the area, the cultures of the area, the physical and biological environments of the area. Everybody has a connection to the local, and taking advantage of that connection and building upon it, I think is critical. Sense of place, nothing more important than that.
I think that's a really good point. And if we can use people's interest in the outdoors, as a way to bring them together around topics of climate change and conservation. Um, that's a natural connection, I think.
And I'd just like to point out that this connection to the out of doors and to nature does not have to be one restricted to rural communities. There's a great series on PBS right now, America Out of Doors by Baratundi Thurston, who grew up in Washington, D.C., whose mother never left the Washington, D.C. area, and yet had him immersed in natural systems as well as the cultural systems that he was more familiar with in the city. And so Baratundi explores the different ways in which people across political, cultural, religious spectra in the United States interact with the out of doors and receive something from that interaction. And to me, it's an absolutely brilliant series, and I highly recommend it. I don't know how easy it is to get elsewhere, but it's in our public broadcasting system here in the US.
Wonderful. So Beverly asked a question in the chat, but I think we're a small enough group now. It's okay for you to unmute and bring your question forward, Beverly.
Okay, it seems that 1991 was the year that climate deniers kind of grew as a group. And why was that a pivotal year? I'm thinking the oil and gas companies began to see climate change as a threat. Is that true?
Well, from my personal perspective, it had to do with George H.W. Bush. George Bush, the elder, at least early in his term, accepted the reality of acid rain and the fact that a combination market and regulatory strategy called cap and trade would work in reducing sulfur emissions and acid rain in North America. It was a tremendous success. It was one of these places where both the public and private sector got together, made something that worked for both sides, and resulted in a 2/3 reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions over the following decade. So the Clean Air Act amendments that were passed in 1990 really demonstrated that a policy-based but public or private corporation sensitive policy could really tackle these huge regional or global issues. So I think that was probably very threatening to the fossil fuels industries. And so they did crank it up even more. And they also, frankly, learned their lessons over time and built on their successes. So the work that some of these groups did in terms of resisting tobacco legislation and regulation, in resisting aerosol CFC reductions, which ultimately failed, but resisted that at least temporarily, and resisted any kind of regulation or recognition of greenhouse gas emissions. I think they got to be more effective. And so, for example, the Koch brothers and their funding of the Heartland Institute came about in the late 80s and early 90s. And so the gears started turning faster, and there was a more receptive environment in the 80s and into the 90s. Obviously, the 70s was still a time when we could agree that we could care about the environment in ways that resulted in our doing something about problems that had been identified. So the Reagan years, I think, helped build that kind of um, doubt um, producing industry, and they went forth and multiplied. Not a lot, though. If you look at who the experts and talking heads are, whether it's with respect to tobaccos, with respect to chemicals, including CFCs, and with respect to greenhouse gases and acid rain, it tends to be a very small group of the same people.
So, Dr. Parnell, as we've been talking, I'm realizing too that 1991 was right after the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate
Climate
Change.
change.
And so it could be that they ramped up their campaigning, thinking that the IPCC would become an effective communication from the scientific community.
I think that gives them a lot of credit, Stefan, and from the experiences that I've seen, the doubt industry tends to be more reactive and less proactive in terms of how they approach a changing scientific message. Again, I think these two books by Lipsky and Michaels are just fantastic in terms of showing how it's basically a one-trick pony that these folks are running over and over again with respect to delaying or preventing successful approaches to solving these environmental issues.
So also we have a question in the chat from Munir Adams, who is joining us from Lagos, Nigeria. Munir, would you like to state your question, or would you like me to read it for Dr. Parnell? You can unmute.
Yeah, hello everyone. So I think you can go ahead. So I just tried to give a bit of background to the question. It's actually very simple, but because our we live in different regions, so our own reality for that particular question is quite different from what is obtainable over there. But to try to quickly summarize, it's basically we have a kind of politics here where it is driven by more of selfish interest over ideologies. So, for example, in the US, you have maybe Democrats and Republicans, which have very clear ideologies as regards their stance on environment, on let's say abortion and those series of issues. But here it's more of you don't know, there is no clear-cut ideology. So the question basically is how what do you think is the best way to actually engage this group of people, knowing that we do not actually have the numbers to support, to tell us, okay, this party supports the environment, or this other party is less willing, and all that. I think that's just a quick summary of my question.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I appreciate your attention and your question. And uh, oil states, and not to reduce Nigeria or Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or any country as just being one thing, but countries that have fossil fuels industries as such a fundamental part of the economy, and I would include the US in that as well, have an extra level of resistance to overcome that a country like Sweden or Germany, without those fossil fuel available to them, really don't have. And so, what I would argue is that what we can do as smaller groups and hopefully building in larger groups is to work on development projects that are sustainable and that can be suitable and appropriate for the communities in which they are um, produced. So groups like Engineers Without Borders here in this country have volunteer um, efforts to try and help individual communities work on sustainable solutions to water quality or to power generation or to agriculture. And I don't, sorry, that's a poor first solution because what it seems to imply on my part is, oh, well, we need to have experts coming from outside of your country to be able to help you solve your problems. And that I do not want to suggest is true. But what I think you're asking for is how can you organize within your own communities to be able to move forward in this direction? And I think part of the issue is we see uh, such horrific pollution problems with respect to the delta and fossil fuels overdevelopment there that we're getting people who are trying to go up against the great big monolith that is the fossil fuels industry in Nigeria and around the globe. So trying to work on smaller projects with respect to safe water, safe agriculture in some of these areas seems like a good place to start. And you can rely upon multinational corporations to be willing to greenwash. That is, you can go to some of these corporations and get some support for some small scale projects. These small scale projects are not going to threaten oil development projects in Nigeria at this level, but might at least provide the opportunity for them to claim that they're doing some good in terms of minimizing future oil development disasters. Does that help at all? When you
Yes, it does a lot. Thank you.
Well, if I could, Dr. Parnell and Munir, you have many different tribes and many different tribal affiliations, even if you don't have the same types of political parties that we've been talking about in the United States. And so if you want to get everybody behind a movement, find those values that are shared across the tribes. And if it's not environmental degradation per se, maybe there are multiple conflicting interests, I don't know, but then human suffering. And examples of human suffering might help to bring everybody together. You know your country better than we do. So I would just suggest to try to find those things, those issues that will bring folks together broadly, whatever those might be. Does that does that suggestion help you to think about what to start with?
Yes, it does. I was actually trying to like note that down, but like it really does make sense because we are quite we have over like 300 tribes or so, so we're a very diverse country. So and that actually makes sense. So yeah.
Well, and different religions, and I know there's a huge diversity, cultural diversity within Nigeria. So, find those things that will stimulate everybody's interest.
Well, one thing that can be a thread to tie some groups together is the concept of stewardship and the fundamental importance of stewardship in both the Islamic and Christian traditions, and being able to draw upon being a good Muslim or a good Christian through your efforts to preserve the environment to the degree that you can as an individual or a group, seems to me to be a place that that we ought to be able to get some more effective interaction and growth.
Well, thank you, Munir. It's an excellent question, and you've made us think too. Any other questions for Dr. Parnell? We still have a few more minutes. We were scheduled till 3:30, and so we still have some minutes for questions. If anybody has any things that they would like to discuss with Dr. Parnell, or just make comments, or any of the above. Camilla tells us she has to leave. I know it's the middle of the night in your part of the world, so thank you all for coming. Any other questions before we adjourn?
Stefan, it's Jill
Hello,
here in
Jill.
Flagstaff. One of the problems we have had in getting people to join in our efforts at NASCA is very noticeably involving young folks. And I'm wondering if Dr. Parnell might have some suggestions specifically for involving, I would say, high school and college age students.
Well, thanks, Joe. Obviously, that is fundamental in trying to move forward with any kind of agenda. Is you can have as many boomers as you want, but that's not what's going to push things forward. And what we found at NAU, for example, I'm the faculty advisor for what are called the Green Jacks. It's the NAU student organization, and having working with students who can get attracted to at least one meeting of a group may be held in the high school or held in some very accessible and well-known venue for students to get them to think about one or two issues that are important to those particular students. And a couple years ago, our groups decided that one-off clothing or it's called fast fashion, I think. The idea of having these cheap, very trendy clothes that basically don't hold up at all is something that should be opposed. And so they came up with a few different ongoing projects to create clothing reuse stores, basically, in our trading projects within the university. So there are a few different places now where you can go and trade in your old clothes to get clothes that are new to you. And it seems to me that that is one place that is occurring, one issue that seems to have a lot of resonance for a wide variety of people in their teens and 20s. So having these students identify their own projects and their own priorities and having that fit into the climate change groups here in northern Arizona can be a way to get them associated with what's happening, it can also provide the opportunity for education and further interaction. But being able to provide whatever resources you might have available to be able to get these students to do their own pet projects can be a real great way to get students' enthusiasm and energy engaged with you and um, and bring them along.
That sounds very reasonable.
Well, and Jill, for instance, this whole proposal for a billion-dollar mega development out on the edge of Flagstaff has brought folks of our generation together to
Mhm.
get it on the ballot and now have a campaign which we think will be successful, this development effort. That's a big deal for us at our age and our life orientation, but maybe less so for the kids. So
Right.
talking to them and finding out what those issues might be, as Dr. Parnell was suggesting. Clothing exchange isn't something I would have necessarily thought of, but that's what came forward in discussions with them. So
Mhm.
I know you've reached out a lot to the high school students, particularly. Whenever you get a chance to ask that question, get whatever thoughts they have, and let's pick them up and empower them to do something.
Right.
And it's not just the thoughts, it's finding something that really has some appeal to the students, something that they're willing to back up with their own effort and energy to be able to make happen. And of course, you tend to want to work harder on something that's your idea that you thought of than maybe something that was imposed upon you by a teacher.
Right. Good point. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Good question, Jill. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Parnell very much for sharing his time with us and his expertise. And I think it's put some good thoughts into our heads in terms of how best to organize and how best to think about putting our communications together to reach folks who really need to be reached. I think we're really good at reaching the folks who are already environmental, but
Yeah.
we need to follow some of Dr. Parnell's suggestions so we can reach beyond the choir, as it were.
Right.
So thank you again very much, Dr. Parnell. Thank you all for coming.
It was a pleasure. Thank you all for engaging and spending the time to talk with us.
Very good. Thank you.